In a world where everyone strives for harmony and success, there is a hidden enemy that saps a person's strength much more insidiously than a running phone with many active applications. This enemy is excessive preoccupation with everything and anything. Endless reflections on words, spoken and unspoken, on the opinions of superiors, and even on the views of pets of distant relatives on life choices turn every day into an emotional marathon that no one signed up for. The paradox is that most of the objects of these experiences do not care at all about the experiencer. An opinion that is scrutinized will be forgotten by noon. The person who is so eager to impress is busy doing the same thing, trying to impress himself. Overcaring is not a virtue, but rather a form of self-sabotage skillfully disguised under a shiny wrapper. Society often presents it as a manifestation of responsibility, emotional intelligence, and even as a sign of a good person. However, removing this mask reveals only overthinking, anxiety, and a whole list of emotional debts that should never have been incurred in the first place. This is where the paradox manifests itself. The more insistently a person strives for pacification through the establishment of total control, the more actively he attracts chaos and confusion. He is desperately trying to influence the perceptions of others, to correct their attitudes toward himself, and to direct the world's reactions in the desired direction. However, it must be recognized that none of these areas are under his direct control. The only tool at his disposal is his own attention, which, unfortunately, has been misdirected. But when the individual realizes this mistake and begins to return his energy, like a landlord collecting debts from negligent tenants, amazing changes occur. Laughter becomes more genuine, sleep becomes deeper, and the compulsive rehearsals of imaginary arguments in the soul cease. One stops playing a role and begins to truly live, tasting the present moment. This is the secret of happiness, not in striving to correct everything and anything, but in the ability to let go of what should not have been a burden in the first place. It is important to note that we are not talking about turning into an apathetic being devoid of any emotions. It is about emotional minimalism, the ability to determine what deserves mental attention and what does not. Paradoxically, it often happens that when a person stops actively pursuing happiness, it itself begins to pursue it. This may seem like a platitude, but it is a very real-life situation. People often worry excessively, believing that caring equals bonding, and that giving up worrying and constant intervention will lead to disaster. In reality, however, it actually leads to their own exhaustion while the world around them goes largely unnoticed. Consider a common example. Many people, after sending a text message, watch the typing indicator intently, as if waiting for an imminent explosion. They worry, overanalyze, and reread their message repeatedly. At the same time, the recipient is probably just selecting the most appropriate emoji for an okay response. There is a pervasive imbalance. Some are investing effort and resources while others are only superficially observing. This trend can be seen in all areas of human endeavor. A person may feel anxious about a colleague's possible negative opinion of his hard work, while the colleague himself is only concerned with hiding his non-work-related online activity. He or she may strive to give the impression of a successful person to those around him or her, while those around him or her, in turn, look for motivation in the videos, trying to compensate for their own dissatisfaction with their achievements. In this way, a person becomes involved in an unspoken competition with those who pursue completely different goals. Excessive concern for other people's opinions is likened to giving unlimited access to one's inner world to those who do not appreciate it. By opening the doors of one's soul and creating a comfortable atmosphere, one runs the risk of neglect and devastation. At a certain point, It is necessary to learn to protect your inner space as a sanctuary, and it should be recognized that others may perceive the refusal of excessive care for things that previously caused pain as a manifestation of coldness. Let them label it as such. This notorious coldness about which envious people are judging, in fact, clearly delineated personal boundaries, crystal clarity of worldview, and a conscious choice. Not to let someone else's bad mood, like a contagion, poison your day. There is no gratitude for such a gift, therefore. Return to the sender without unnecessary ceremony. The less effort is spent on fruitless attempts to please everyone you meet, the more precious space is freed up for genuine self-care. And we are not talking about trivial narcissism in a bubble bath, but about the urgent need to do what allows you to preserve your mental balance and common sense. In this liberated space, a person does not become an unfeeling chump. On the contrary, he acquires the ability to selectively relate to external stimuli. He does not shut himself off from the world with an impregnable wall, but simply stops letting into his head all those who do not even bother to knock before breaking in. And here is what is important to understand. The emotional world of man is not always shaken by thunderous shocks. Most often it manifests itself in a quiet, barely perceptible aha, an inner agreement that something that previously hurt no longer causes the slightest harm. Is someone talking badly behind your back? A rumor of it reaches your ears, and all you get in response is a quiet, "Okay." That's it. No hours of mental battles, no exhausting imaginary arguments under the shower, just good. It is worth realizing an important truth. Not every insult requires a response, and not every conflict needs immediate intervention. Often people, without realizing it, spill out their own inner worries and anxieties, subconsciously seeking to shift them onto someone else's shoulders. However, you should not become an unwitting carrier of other people's emotional baggage, because everyone has enough of their own problems and unresolved issues. As the desire to react to provocations decreases, it becomes possible to observe what is happening from the outside. You notice how quickly people reveal their true nature when you stop playing along with their emotional manipulations. They attack, but are not repulsed. And at that moment, the observer suddenly turns into a villain. It is amazing how calmness and equanimity are perceived as arrogance by those who are used to drawing attention to themselves only through chaos and scandal. Surely everyone is familiar with the situation when after the end of the conversation suddenly realized that most of the time only nodded in agreement, while the interlocutor poured out his soul, as if at a free session of psychotherapy. It's something like that, isn't it? Everyone is probably unique in their perceptions, but it's worth noting, people don't actually seek to stop caring about them. Rather, they expect attention and involvement with enough regularity to remain predictable and available. They appreciate gentleness at times when it suits their convenience. However, as soon as a person changes this established pattern of behavior, they begin to be perceived as having changed, as if they have done something reprehensible. But the truth is that the world around us inevitably transforms the individual, making them different from the previous version of themselves. This is especially noticeable for those who are used to using the old qualities of the person, for situations that were effective only when he or she was emotionally available on demand, like some kind of internal on-demand service. A refusal to overreact emotionally does not indicate insensitivity. It indicates that the person has stopped allowing others to control his emotions. He no longer suppresses himself to drown out external noise. He does not become callous, but simply ceases to be susceptible to meaningless things. The richer a person's inner world becomes, the more acutely he realizes how addicted those around him are to drama. This is not just about television soap operas, but also about real life and everyday theatricality. People often create conflicts just to experience some emotions, to fight with their own shadows, because silence seems alien and unfamiliar to them. There comes a moment when a person realizes that he or she has outgrown the need for bustle and noise. There is no longer a need to spend energy on correcting other people's misperceptions. Energy is no longer spent on fruitless attempts to prove one's rightness or refute false accusations. Misunderstandings cease to be collector's items, like rare specimens. The reason lies in the fact that life experience fosters selectivity with regard to spending one's own resources. One comes to realize that not every dialogue is a path to mutual understanding. Some conversations are like blank walls that can only exhaust one's resources. People engage in conversations for different purposes. Some seek validation, others yearn to be heard, and most simply enjoy the sound of their own voice, creating a comfortable cocoon of self-deception. The true change, however, occurs when the interest in being understood gives way to the desire for self-knowledge. It is at this point that emotional independence is engendered. A person ceases to depend on other people's opinions to assess his or her own worth. Being ignored by others does not cause insecurity, but becomes a valuable source of information. Silence ceases to be perceived as rejection and begins to be interpreted as a space for reflection and introspection. Freeing up space that can now be filled with awareness, fresh thoughts, or even simple pleasures of life such as good food and adequate rest. Herein lies a truth that many choose to ignore. The most meaningful moments in life often come not in a whirlwind of emotions, but in moments of quiet release from the unnecessary. A person stops responding to messages in a machine-like manner, stops expending energy defending their position, gets rid of the habit of constantly checking to see who is interested in their life on social media. It is in this pause, in this silence, that the real power lies. Those around him may think that there has been a change, but in fact, the man has simply stopped expending himself on those who are not ready to offer even the slightest support. He no longer seeks to play a role in someone else's story, leaves the stage of the ostentatious world, and finds refuge in the solitude of true self-respect. And here's the paradox. Suddenly, the man's absence becomes more noticeable than his presence ever was. When he stops responding to provocation, those around him sense his inner strength. When he stops making excuses, questions and speculation begin to arise in the minds of others. And when he stops pushing for attention, what is truly meant for him comes into his life without too many invitations. In reality, inner strength does not always manifest itself in boisterous statements. Sometimes it lies in a quiet but confident refusal to be involved in destructive scenarios, in provocations and debilitating situations. This does not mean detachment from the realities of life, but rather the acquisition of immunity to excessive emotional burden, which is like an exorbitant tax. Experience suggests that paying such a bill only leads to emotional burnout. Now the focus of attention shifts to investing energy in those areas where it brings tangible returns: personal peace, self-development, achievement of goals. Such a change causes discomfort for those who are used to reactivity, yielding, and unresponsiveness. As soon as a person stops reacting painfully to the slightest changes in the environment, he begins to realize how much of life was just noise, skillfully disguised as urgent matters. Paradoxically, many people mistakenly believe that they have deep empathy, when in fact, they have simply been taught to take on an overwhelming emotional burden. There is a fundamental difference between true compassion and the emotional overload that occurs repeatedly throughout the day. Not every vibration picked up in the environment needs to be carried. For example, if one enters a room with an oppressive atmosphere, one suddenly feels a heaviness in one's soul. There are times when someone else's irritation is instantly transmitted like a virus, and now you feel out of place. And the one who caused discomfort has already forgotten about what happened and laughs carelessly at some joke. In the head, obsessively revolves the question, what did I do wrong? But that's not the point. It's just that the realization that energetic boundaries are just as important as physical ones hasn't come yet. Protecting your inner world isn't about being rude. Being able to direct attention inward is not coldness. Often the desire to please everyone and everything originates as a way of survival, but over time turns into a form of self-denial. And here's a question that is rarely asked out loud. Why do you owe anyone your reactions at all? Indeed, why should someone else's passive aggression drain precious resources from your emotional system? Why should a random comment on the internet parasitize your nervous system? He doesn't deserve it, or rather, he didn't deserve it until today. This is where the quiet rebellion begins. Not violent or dramatic, but simply a refusal to participate in someone else's chaos. Suddenly, the realization comes, wait, if I don't give any reaction, they will lose control over me. In today's world, as if at the snap of fingers, a realization is revealed. Much of human interaction is permeated with emotional manipulation. It is not always with malicious intent. Often people do it unknowingly, but the fact remains that manipulation is present. Subtle guilt games, emotional baiting, unspoken demands to conform to the moods of those around you, otherwise, you become the problem. But no, it's not coldness, it's internal calibration. It's not detachment, but discernment that allows you to see the essence of things. It's not satiety. It's realizing the value of your own energy, which is too precious to waste on things that don't contribute to personal growth. And here is something that is not commonly spoken about out loud. There comes a period when the world around you begins to seem devoid of bright colors, even boring. Of course, there will be a lack of emotional highs, moments when it is so necessary to confirm their own importance. There will be an itchy desire to feel the dopamine rush of skillful defense of one's interests. There will be a temptation to return to the usual chaos, to feel alive again. But this fleeting urge gradually fades, giving way to something much more powerful: crystal clarity. It is not the nervous, contrived clarity that results from impulsive reactions, but a slow, unwavering knowledge that says, I don't need to be omnipresent. I don't need to respond to everything. I don't need to get involved in battles that had nothing to do with me in the first place. This is reminiscent of the long-awaited high school graduation, when theatricality, over-explanation, and obsessive seeking of approval from others lose their appeal and relevance. The person realizes that most of the conflicts were not with others, but with his own desire to please everyone. This may be a unique experience, but that is the point. An amazing power is revealed when an individual stops striving for emotional invulnerability and begins to selectively open up to the world. There is no need to become callous, only to stop volunteering to take on every emotional whirlwind. Many people mistakenly believe that strength lies in invulnerability, but this is not true. True strength is found in the ability to feel deeply without letting emotions manipulate you. It is possible to care but on your own terms, to experience feelings but with conscious control, to love but without dissolving into another person. It is not about gaining insensitivity, but about developing awareness and purposefulness in one's reactions. When a person tries to shift their internal problems and negativity onto another person, the previous version of that person would probably immediately rush to fix the situation, go into unnecessary explanations, or spend hours reflecting on their own mistakes. However, the updated version of the person will simply bow their head and mentally note, "This has nothing to do with me," and then calmly continue on their way. There is not an ounce of arrogance in this, only crystal clarity. It is the realization that not every emotion deserves to be picked up, not every insult needs to be answered, and not every provocative invitation to conflict requires a response. The person begins to live according to a new internal code of behavior. He doesn't flaunt it, doesn't make loud speeches, but simply withdraws imperceptibly from the games in which he was once involved. Suddenly, those around him lose the ability to manipulate his feelings, not because he no longer has vulnerabilities, but because he has shut down the entire system that allowed them to be influenced. This level of detachment is not a manifestation of coldness, but a state of purity and uncloudedness. It does not mean the absence of feelings, but rather the ability to control their manifestation and not allow them to spill out. When one has mastered this art, one ceases to chase the approval and recognition of the world and becomes the world itself, not in an ostentatious, pseudo-Zen way, but in a genuine, peaceful state where there is no need to prove anything. Surely each of us has encountered a situation where energy is gratuitously wasted on those who don't appreciate it. Perhaps it is time to reassess your priorities and stop this practice. There is no point in wasting words explaining to those who are not initially inclined to understand. There is no point in giving your precious time to people who are not ready to reciprocate. It is important to learn to distinguish true value from empty noise. In silence, in tranquility, lies true strength, a strength that does not need shouting and proof. This is the power that makes those around you think about their attitudes. If these words resonate in your soul, if they evoke a sense of recognition, you should not remain indifferent. Join like-minded people, because it is not an accident that you are here. If you have reached this point, it means that there is a resonance with this way of thinking. You should not stop at what you have achieved. You should continue to move forward together.